Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to our event, organized jointly by the Asian Studies Unit at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies and our partners at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Today's event focuses on an important topic that has attracted considerable attention at the academic, journalistic, and policymaking levels: the realities of China's security presence in the Middle East, and whether, as a great power, it has aspirations to play a greater role or even to reorder the regional security architecture. Today, we are privileged to have with us an excellent group of scholars to help us better understand this topic. We have Dr. Alessandro Arduino, who is the Principal Research Fellow at the Middle East Institute in the National University of Singapore. He is also the co-director of the Security and Crisis Management International Center at the Shanghai Academy of Social Science, and an external associate at the Lao China Institute in King's College, London. He has over 2 decades of experience in China and has written extensively on issues dealing with security and crisis management in relation to China, Central Asia, and the Middle East. We also have with us Dr. Shending Li, who is a professor and former executive dean at Fudan University's Institute of International Studies and former director of the Center for American Studies. He is also an honorary visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis. He has taught international security, China-US relations, China's foreign and defense policy, as well as many other topics. He was the vice president of the Chinese Association of South Asian Studies, the Shanghai Association of American Studies, as well as the vice president of the Shanghai Association of International Studies, among others. And lastly, we have with us Dr. Andrea Giazelli, who is an assistant professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs of Fudan University. He is also a non-resident research fellow with the Two China Hub's China Med Project, which is another partner of the King Faisal Center. His research interests also focus on Chinese foreign policy, as well as China's wider engagement with the Mediterranean region, which subsumes the Middle East. He has also written extensively on security issues and international relations. The event today follows the typical format we've followed in the past. It'll be for around an hour and 30 minutes, of which 45 to 50 minutes will be dedicated to the core discussion, followed by an opportunity for the audience to pose questions in the remaining time. I ask the audience throughout the event to write up their questions in the question box below. We will also permit, if need be, questions to be posed audio-visually. The event will follow a conversational format with a set of pre-prepared questions posed to each of the speakers. Now, let's jump into it directly. The first question is addressed to Dr. Giazelli. Given that the rise of China is oftentimes imagined in concretely economic terms, perhaps it might be best to initiate the discussion on security through that prism. What do you see as the relationship between China's sizable economic footprint in the Middle East and its security presence there? And perhaps some ancillary questions to that: will it be drawn into the region, assuming a greater role as a result of these proliferating economic interests? And also what has happened so far?
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Mohammed, for the invitation. Thank you to the King Faisal Center, as well as to the Middle East Institute of NUS for inviting me to join in this great event. I hope I prepared a few preliminary answers to this question, which I hope will provide a good basis for both for the follow-up by my 2 distinguished colleagues, as well as for comments and questions from the audience. So let me share just the screen with 2 very quick points. So definitely economy is the main thing that draws China to the Middle East for the moment. And if we think about China, I think in the security architecture of the region, a big question that we should ask is whether China is an actor or a factor in the region, and between which which of these 2 roles will assume or keep in the future. I believe for the moment, China is somehow at a crossroad in the sense that there are reasons for it to be considered an actor as well, reasons for it to be considered as a factor. So I will briefly discuss the two of them, and then I think we can listen what the other speakers think about it. So definitely China is, we consider it an actor, so an agent of change, an agent as an actor that can pursue its interest as well as support those of other regional actors. Mostly this is because of three things, which I listed here in the slides on the left column. Definitely China, we all know it's incredible, it's incredibly huge. Energy market is a key source of revenues for all producing countries in the region, which is of course extremely important, not only for those countries, especially now that demand for oil and other energy product is decreasing in other parts of the world, but also because, of course, these countries use not only those revenues to finance their own economic development, pay pensions and so far and so on, social welfare, but also because usually these revenues are then redistributed through regional aid programs throughout the region. So in a way, China, even just only by being there, thanks it's a huge economy, provides also helps to support regional stability, as in the and it is because regional development is of course probably the lack of regional development, was probably the main cause for the so-called Arab Spring 2011 and still remains one of the key issues in the region. Also, of course, China, although this is not an economic factor, is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, can be considered a heavyweight. And finally, China also is involved in the anti-piracy operations, the Gulf of Aden, and it also has a peacekeeping force, part of UNIFIL in Lebanon. So all these three kind of elements help China again to shape actively regional politics and regional security trends. However, we always talk about big countries, great powers as actors, but I think when it comes to China, especially in this moment, it's important to consider also a factor in the sense that it is something that is it's also a passive element in the region, it doesn't only have influence, but it also has significant potential liabilities. In particular, there are two reasons why China is a factor and might be and sort of can shape its role in the future, maybe becoming more of an actor or not. So the first element, and these are the elements on the right, are of course the massive presence, the massive human and economic footprint in the region. And these I'm not considering, here I'm talking about the Middle East, not just, I mean, in a broader way. So I'm also including, for example, North Africa here. There are many, it's very difficult to tell the exact number of Chinese nationals in the regions, but it's definitely well above the 100,000. Of course, the region is a huge market for its engineering companies. So it's a big presence there. What is interesting is that so far China has always tried to, kind of avoid being involved in thorny regional crises and so on. However, and this is the result of a recent study that probably I hope to see online soon in the China Quarterly with that I authored with a dear friend and colleague, Pippa Morgan. Our study showed that although the Chinese government have tried over the years to improve the mechanism through which it can help its the companies in the region to react to security crises, also to regional instability and so on, actually we see that usually these companies tend to be very risk acceptant, extremely, and also highly uncertainty acceptant, despite the warnings sent by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing and the Chinese embassies in the region, which essentially means that a lot of times We already saw it happening in 2011, of course, with the evacuation of about 36,000 Chinese nationals from Libya. But basically, there's not been any significant learning on the side of Chinese companies, which remain basically they withdraw their workers from the region only when incidents have already happened. They usually do not follow the warnings of Chinese diplomats. So in a way, that's a big potential liability that might throw China further into the regional security architecture. Another issue, which I think is also very important and that is even less talked about, is China as a potential attractive partner for many countries in the region. This is not necessarily a liability, but it might become so whenever local actors try to create narrative that somehow implies that China is supporting them. And again, these are a study that, of course, we are doing together, Mohammed and I. And if we see this, for example, in the case of Syria, in the broader narrative that is going around in the region of an axis of resistance, it's a narrative that is mostly created by Syria, Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and so on, which basically depict China as a partner or a friend, at least, of a group of countries that is fighting for survival against American imperialism. In this narrative, China is described as providing critical support, both diplomatic support to the UN, but also as a key partner for the future reconstruction if and when the war will be over. In this case, China, of course, is depicted then as a friend again of these countries, so Iran, Syria, and so on, and an enemy or at least an opponent of not only Western countries but also of Israel and the monarchies of the Gulf. So, of course, it's a more confrontational picture of what China's actual stance is in the region. Just to say, for example, after China casted its vetoes between 2011 and 2012 at the United Nations, so to prevent what it feared could become Western intervention to topple the Syrian regime, the Chinese special envoy to the region had to fly many times to the Gulf, sorry, to explain that China was not actually defending, was not casting veto to protect Bashar al-Assad per se, but rather it was acting so to defend the principle of sovereignty, especially after the NATO intervention in Libya. So these narratives, of course, do not, as long as China does not really step up with its support to countries like Syria, will always remain only narratives. But at the same time, we cannot really discount their power, especially because these narratives circulate in regional media, in Arabic and Farsi, potentially shaping public opinion, eventually might get some grip even among the elite. So altogether, I believe that Chinese can be already considered an actor in regional security. This is also thanks to a large extent, also thanks to its economy. But however, its own economy and its own attractiveness as a rising non-Western great power might also, which for the moment makes it more factor in the regional security architecture, might also draw it into thorny regional issues. So what can be the future is difficult to tell. I believe that for the moment, China is not really interested in playing a more active role, at least to invest more resources into and becoming a regional security guarantor. However, I believe that there is the potential there for it to be drawn into that role, even without wanting it to be. It can be another, second Libya crisis eventually, not in Libya, but somewhere else. It can be, a government creating, telling to other, can be Syria or Iran, implying too much that China is supporting them. It's difficult to tell, but there are these potential. China has this sort of liabilities that might one day cost it dearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Giazelli. I mean, I really liked the sort of holistic view that you've presented about, the question of security that sort of goes beyond the traditional bounds of military assets, but also involves thinking about China's economic presence in the region and also sort of its diplomatic roles as also part of its security toolkit. And I think also the points that you've raised about liabilities, especially with regards to narratives, is an interesting one, because we often think about China's liabilities as arising from its economic presence in terms of workers, the growing diaspora, which you had mentioned briefly, or just also the protection of merchant fleets, right, and sort of combating anti-piracy in terms of the development of naval assets in the Gulf of Aden, but also in Djibouti, for example. So I've really enjoyed that take. And in fact, what I want to do now maybe is also draw on another unconventional take, is to call on Dr. Arduino, if he has any particular thoughts, given his own past research on this topic, on sort of some of the Chinese non-state actors in this overall landscape. I believe you wrote a bit on sort of the role of private security companies, and I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about them that you'd like to share.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Sudari. And first of all, please, before starting, allow me to thank you for the excellent work that you did in coordinating this event between King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Study and the Middle East Institute here at the National University of Singapore. Having said that, basically, Andrea covered extremely well the matter of security and economic development. I just want to take some key point among his presentation, and is China is, let's say, an unwilling security actor in some respect, but in a matter or in another, in a future that is definitely not going to be so far, we'll have to increase and step up its involvement in the Middle East and in North Africa. Having said that, at the moment, there are several security gaps, and these security gaps mainly are related to the protection of the Belt and Road infrastructure and the Chinese personnel and all the other works in this infrastructure. Private security, the Chinese private security, address part of this gap. Talking about private and China, of course, can raise some eyebrow, especially with the relationship between the government and the private security company, and the role that the private security company play in cooperating with the state-owned enterprises. The story about China and private security in the Middle East predate the Belt and Road Initiative, because private security companies were already providing guarding service to Chinese energy state-owned enterprises, especially the one based in Iraq. In a summary, I just want to make this point. Private security address a small part of the security gap in a changing, fast-changing security environment. And this gap is to avoiding having Chinese boot on the ground. Case, as Andrea mentioned, about Libya, exfiltration of Chinese workers during the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi regime, case in more recent in the Horn of Africa, and so on, can underline the necessity to analyze risk, to mitigate risk, and in some part, this is done by the private security sector. China has a quite lively and growing private security sector in mainland China, more than 5,000 to 8,000 companies that sum up to more than 3 million officers. But outside China, there are just few companies, more than a dozen, that operate professionally in cooperation with international company, in cooperation with local company. I refer especially the case of Iraq for protecting CNOPC, for example, is quite important. And this, in some respect, avoid Beijing to getting involved in the so-called Middle East security quagmire. Having said that, most of these companies provide guarding service protecting gated infrastructure. But there are already some companies who are already upgrading their kind of security service, and mainly it's armed service for protecting vessel in anti-piracy effort, especially along the Horn of Africa, Somali coast, and so on, and on the cyber part of security, providing facial recognition and security software. These underline the fact that Beijing have a kind, let's say, of desire to nurture the development of professional private security sector in China that is able to, let's say, operate in a complex environment. And by complex environment, I mean also the cooperation between international private security company, Chinese private security company, and international insurance, especially in respect to the problem of kidnapping and ransom. Because as you noticed, when you need to exfiltrate several thousand of workers at once, then there is a rationale, a security and an economic rationale for the People Liberation Army Navy to intervene. But then when it's the case of one, two, let's say, few workers, then it's going to be probably the private security sector. But there is still a dire need of rule of engagement in order to operate in this environment, especially in area where the local state are unable or unwilling to protect Chinese investment in the area. Basically, if we want to just to summarize what is the footprint and the necessity for the Chinese private security company in the MENA region, is first and foremost providing a vision of what kind of risk the state-owned enterprises and even the Chinese private company are going to face, and that's to be inserted in the business feasibility study. As Andrea mentioned, unfortunately, there is a quite high percentage of this company that have still a very high appetite to invest even in complex and very dangerous area. Mostly because they still believe that just taking the phone and calling the Chinese consulate can solve any kind of problem. And this has been probably increased after the second Chinese movie blockbuster Wolf Warrior has been aired on the screen. A second part is risk management. That is basically how to monitor the evolution of risk and the impact of the Chinese investment in local community. And then, as I mentioned before, for the insurance sector is risk transfer. How to cooperate with national insurance company in China and international risk company in providing audit report compliance. And last but not least, training for the security personnel and even for the Chinese workers that are going abroad. So basically, this is a very, let's say, condensed view of what is the presence of the Chinese private security sector in the Middle East and North Africa. Back to you, Mohammed.
Actually, just as a quick follow-up, though, and very briefly, how many companies are we talking about in the ground? Do we have a sense of this figure? Where are they concentrated in?
Let's say, as I mentioned before, if we are looking at anti-piracy, then we are looking mostly at one company that is Huaxinzhongan, that is operating from Bab al-Mandeb to the Somali coast and along that area, providing security for oil vessel and for COSCO shipping vessel. And it's one of the few Chinese companies that operate with contractors carrying weapons, Chinese contractor carrying weapons. While in the other area, Horn of Africa, for example, is getting quite hot lately. So there are quite upscale company like Highway that are operating in the area, or in Iraq. Mostly at the beginning in Iraq, we are talking at the southern part of Iraq that is less critical than in other area. But then China in the last 2-3 years has been more aggressive in getting bid in the northern part. And for example, in the Kurd-controlled area, there are private security companies that work with local Kurd armed militia in cooperation with the Chinese. Then if we are talking about Syria or this kind of country, I don't see much at the moment this kind of footprint, but for example, in area like Egypt, even if I recall correct, the diplomatic service is protected by a private security company that is local, because a foreign company cannot carry weapon in Egypt, but is in cooperation with a Chinese private security company, just to give you a brief picture. So we are talking about a complex environment, but not very high complex environment.
Thank you so much. Maybe now we can turn to Dr. Shen. I actually have two sort of combined questions with one another, which is, I mean, if you could give us a sense of some of the official views and perspectives in China regarding the security question in the Middle East, and sort of also some of the tools and platforms that China uses in realizing these views or visions about Middle Eastern security. I mean, for example, we've heard a lot of talk about organizing a Middle East Security Forum, which the King Faisal Center has also participated in 2019, as a platform for addressing unresolvable, or at least very difficult and sensitive security issues like these. If there are others you could think about and you would be open to sharing with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Middle East seems to be a remote presence to many Chinese. China probably cares its neighborhood. We care its peripheral diplomacy, or major power diplomacy, working with Europe, Japan, Russia, US, etc. So Middle East is in between. It's closer than America, but we don't know much about its culture and the religion. For a long time, China has been grateful to many Middle East countries for their support to China, for China's legitimate position in the United Nations. Over time, we also hope that all people and all nations in Middle East should have equal rights to survive, to develop, and to deserve their security. So over time, China changed its position to build an official relationship with Middle East. And China thinks I should not be someone who looks at the Middle East. With China's ever-rising economic profile, China is unavoidably has been more closely connected with Middle East. We need oil. We don't want a Middle East that is for all kind of a rivalry. Palestinian national rights and Israeli Jewish people's rights. We are caught. We want peace. If they are peaceful, it's good for China to do business, to have, we don't need to take side. We used to take side with Palestine. And we don't take side with Israel, but we need to build a normal relationship with Israel. Not all Middle East countries, Arabic countries understand this. Probably Libya and Iran may have difficulty in understanding why China need to build an official relationship with Israel. So that's always a challenge to China. When Iranian and Israeli friends are with us, so we have to be very careful. And then I think China has taken a number of initiatives to help. If we cannot build the peace, at least we need to be helpful. Tool number one, yes. In addition to our bilateral relationship with many friends in Middle East, in addition to our participation in the UN-based all kinds of platforms, China has appointed from 2002 our president's special envoy, 中东和平特使 for peace. So by now we have had 5 high-level Chinese diplomats, some at the assistant foreign minister level, Mr. Zai Jun, the current one, who assumed his job in 2019, last year. Its role is to pay visit to this country, try to bridge the communication between Israel and Palestinian. We deeply, we feel we have our sympathy to our Palestinian friend, and we hope they would deserve their statehood. So China is one of the major powers which recognize the statehood of Israel, even though the United Nations has not done this yet. Meantime, we try to communicate with Israel, and we are against all sorts of terrorism, not this kind of terrorism, but we are against all kinds of terrorism. You know what I'm talking about. And Israel understand. And in May 2013, 7 years ago, it's very interesting. Chinese government invited both Palestinian President Abbas and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to Beijing. I met Netanyahu in Shanghai. He gave a speech. I was one of the audience. Some people say these two leaders may meet in Beijing. We all hope this would happen, but this did not happen. But I would not think it's simply a coincidence that they come to China around the same time, but they miss with each other by 1 day. So this is China's, I think, some attempt, try to bridge the difference. Someday in the future, maybe we would invite them to Beijing or to Shanghai at the same place on the same day. We will see. So this is one of the tools, special envoy. And the second tool is some Chinese company. They presume they are international NGO, not a Chinese domestic NGO. They are global NGO. This is a foundation for Middle East Foundation for Peace and Development, which is a Chinese organization, but it has great ambition. It has put a board of directors inviting Dr. Henry Kissinger to be its honorary chairman, and Dr. Kissinger agreed. So lots of high-level Middle East countries, diplomats, politicians, like Egyptian former prime ministers, serve on the board. And every few years they convened a forum. Last forum was convened in 2019 in Beijing. So they attracted some 60 countries from Middle East, from all over the world. They have embassy in Beijing. These diplomats were invited as they come to this meeting. This is very unique. Probably not many people would believe this is simply a company's, a private NGO. In China, probably we have no NGO. We have government sponsored NGO. People call them as Gongo, government-sponsored NGO, which is half NGO, but Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party's vice minister for international liaison. It's like a party's foreign minister, send its vice minister to this very high-level meeting. And people meet with each other and speak. That's great. So I think this is China's subtle attempt. Try to reach out, try to have a say that we can benefit from Middle East peace and prosperity, and we may invite our friend from the region to exchange our view. Plot number 3, how to persuade the region to be nuclear weapon free. So every 5 years, the NPT treaty would have a review conference. So China would be with the global members of the NPT to support some initiative to make the Middle East soon free of nuclear weapons. Probably Israel is not very happy with this, but China thinks it's not good for someone to stay outside of the NPT and to be allergic to have nuclear weapons. Better to join NPT as a non-nuclear state. So we try to play a role, and we have not succeeded. But non-nuclear weapon states in the region who are members of the NPT, who promise not to develop nuclear weapons, like Iran, Iraq, they think it's a good idea. And Israel knows China does not name Israel, and China says the things that many other countries would say. So Israel does not feel greater pressure, and understand China. But Israel assumes that Iran may be developing nuclear weapon, and American successful U.S. government assume. So U.S., China, P5 plus Germany, these 6 powers negotiated at the time of President Obama to reach a deal, JCPOA. First, Iran should honor its promise not to build a nuclear weapon and its capacity. The second, as a non-nuclear weapon state which receive normal and special IAEA's inspection, Iran should be entitled to peaceful use of nuclear energy. So this has been worked out, JCPOA, at the time of Obama, but unfortunately, America has quit this first week of President Trump's tenure. And probably this would not be President Biden's first initiative. He would be busy with bringing the US back to WHO, back to Paris Climate Change Accord. But soon after, America would renegotiate with others, possibly to be back to the JCPOA. That would be great. So Iran would be more relieved. America would abide by its word to relieve its sanction on Iran as long as Iran would be committed to its own obligation. So after a test, probably the collaborative work, US, China, and other powers plus Germany would be more fruitful. You never know what would happen in the future. But with a joint effort, China played a special role in convincing America and others. Americans say Iran has some nuclear power station, and Iran want to keep them. Americans say those heavy water reactors may be more possible to be converted with producing nuclear fissile material for weapons. But China say, I want to help them by keeping these civilian rights, but at the same time, this converted reactor will be less able to produce this deadly material. So Americans say, good. So probably we are going to have a new page, a more positive, constructive page that Iran would be more assuring the rest of the world, and Iran would be rewarded. And Israel would be more assured. And Israel would do less to make others to feel upset. So let's work together. Even we cannot make Middle East totally, all members to commit nuclear weapon free, but at least we can work together in a collaborative approach to make it better. And China is against the US unilateral use of the so-called preemption in Iraq. Iraq may have some problem, but it's up to Iraqi people to settle that problem. Without UN sanction, UN agreement, without proper evidence, it's highly inappropriate to send military into the country. That benefits no American, and that brings damage to Iraq. So with some UN meeting to help relieve the debt Iraqi government has owed to other countries, China said, you don't need to return the money, it's for free. So we joined the rest of the world to make a new Iraqi government less burdened by its debt owed by its previous government. So we try to do this, I would not say small things, but they are probably not great things, step by step, to make a better Middle East, where we are viewed as a responsible power. Then China's shipping in the Gulf region for oil from Iran, if Iran would be relieved the sanction, so China's buying of this Iranian oil would be not be viewed as illegal. So Iran is happy having money, and the JCPOA has more chance to assist the IAEA to assure Iran is honoring its word. So all these are China's tool, China's platform to make Middle East great for China and a greater China for a better Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shen. I mean, you gave a comprehensive statement of Chinese positions on a variety of issues, whether it's about Iranian nuclear procurement or its stance with regards to disputant parties, like with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the occupation rather. And I also appreciated that you were highlighting some of the different institutional tools, especially the platforms that China tries to provide for dialogue. And I think that the fact that you've highlighted the International Liaison Department for the Communist Party is also very important, because people tend to think of China solely in state terms. But in fact, the party also has its own toolkits and ways of engagement, which are increasingly a lot more important. I think now perhaps we can go to the final question before we open the floor for questions from the broader audience. And this one is, I think, maybe addressed to everyone, but we could also invite Arduino to begin with answering it, is perhaps we can discuss a bit about rivalry dynamics, because when we talk about China's security presence in the Middle East, we can't talk about it in isolation. We have, for example, at the level of the great powers, an intensifying Sino-American rivalry and competition that is expressing itself both globally and at the regional level. But we also have at the level of the region itself, multiple middle powers that are competing with one another. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and we could even include some also smaller powers that also have considerable influence, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. So how is this different mishmash of rivalries affecting China's security assessments and behaviors in the region, according to your own views?
Well, let's start to say that if we are talking about geostrategic competition, is not a new story in the Middle East. Sea lane of communication, strategic choke point, and natural resources are a primary strategic objective, not only for superpower, but for regional power as well. As we are trying to look today in this webinar, we are addressing a fact that is quite straightforward. There is a changing security architecture in the Middle East. What is not straightforward at all is the direction that these changes are taking us. There's been a lot of talk to the fact that United States military presence is rebalancing. The engagement between China and the United States, or the disengagement in some respect, we will have to wait until basically January 20, when President-elect Biden is going to take place at the White House. But then in this respect, we can see that the global geostrategic competition still is going to witness the United States as a global military power. United States is not going to leave the Middle East. And in this respect, I can summarize it with a statement that I heard just a few days ago during the Manama dialogue in Bahrain by Vice Admiral Paparo, Samuel Paparo. He's the commander of the Fifth Fleet. And Admiral Paparo just said basically that the United States is in a stabilizing defensive posture. And in my personal opinion, that summarizes very well what are the considerations that also China have to take on the table when is going somewhat forced to get involved in the security, new security architecture. Having said that, Vice Admiral Paparo also underlined how what is the intention of the United States, quoting General Mattis. And General Mattis, looking at the defensive posture, said quite straightforward: be polite, be professional, and have always a plan to kill everyone in the room. So that's quite straightforward, the position from the US. And in this respect, China then is still going to have an increasing role. But what Professor Shen just mentioned before, Chinese foreign policy is an investment-centric approach policy. And all the regional power in the Middle East and North Africa know very well that China is probably the first and most important investor, but also that China has several, let's say, weakness in terms of being a security provider. President Xi Jinping himself called for the reform of the People Liberation Army that has to be achieved by 2027. So it's still a long way to go. But then if we are going to look at the security competition between United States and China, then of course, not only economic, but the technological challenge is going to be a very important one. And by technological challenge in security dimension, I mean cybersecurity. Moving from this, I can see that also we have to look what are the different perceptions that the different regional players have on China. Andrea addressed it extremely well, and we can say that from a security purpose, one of the direction that we can see is China looking at somewhat the Russian proposal for have a multilateral order that is also linked with the United Nations. So basically, I want just to summarize my intervention, say that China is going to increase, to be forced to increase in somewhat his security footprint in the years to come in the Middle East, while in the last 10 years, China has already increased its economic footprint. And this can be done in several ways, and in one that I like to term balanced vagueness. What I mean with balanced vagueness is first and foremost have a strategy that play in one country in the Middle East, and this strategy don't create friction with the other strategy that the country plays in the other part of the region. And floor back to you, Mohammed.
I'm wondering if Dr. Giazelli or Dr. Shen have any thoughts about these rivalry dynamics that they'd like to add.
Sure. So my understanding of China's own understanding of the security trends in the region is that until a few years ago, Chinese scholars and analysts look at state fragility as the main source of threats in the region, not just for them, but in general, especially after the Arab Spring, of course. This has changed significantly. Now there are many voices that talk about both state fragility in the region and great power competition as something that is coming back. And my impression was that not many expected it to come back so quickly, especially with under the Trump administration. That said, my impression is that in regard with the great power competition, my impression is that China sees its own interest as closer to the Russian ones than to the American ones. But this is not to say that China, of course, and we saw it this kind of convergence of interest materializing a couple of times, especially over Syria. But at the same time, I think we must be very careful always to look at China's position always as necessarily as anti-American. If you look at what Chinese scholars write about Russia, for example, we see that they do not consider Russia as a panacea for the region. They tend to be skeptical about Russian intentions, Russian resources to invest in the region. So they do not necessarily say that we are eventually with changing of the posture of the United States in the region, or eventually a withdrawal, we are going to something better. I think this is important to say. So again, there is this, my impression is that still the preference would be for wait and see. Wait for what? I'm not sure, but still like not turning the Middle East in another issue in the already very tense Sino-American relations. As to regional rivalries, again, I think China's diplomatic position, official position, is very clear. China does not want regional powers to play the so-called China card, does not want to be drawn into regional rivalries. as much as possible. That does not mean, of course, that China, or at least again Chinese scholars and elite look at regional rivalries in the same way, or this clear preference for to ensure, for example, that Iran is not destroyed, essentially, either economically or militarily in any way. Of course, there is still some, if we look at the issue of Israel and the Palestinians, there are voices that at least have noticed many times that the clash between the Israeli-Palestinian issue has been sidelined in the region, whereas it should be at the very center of the regional politics. There is quite a lot of skepticism about Turkey and its very proactive diplomacy in the region, from Syria to Libya, and the competition in the Eastern Mediterranean. Again, and there is no real interest in being drawn in, but definitely there is a lot of concern for what they see as an increasingly important factor in regional diplomacy. I would say something that further convinced probably the leadership in Beijing to stay out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shen, would you like to share with us the last
Sure.
thoughts?
Sure. China, US are two big countries. US #1 in economic output, in generating original science and technology. And China has a rich history, and China is humble in sending the biggest group of students to study in the US. And many of them stay in the US to help America, and many of them, like myself, returning to China to help my own country. They have very complicated relationship. China thinks that I have been hurt, opium war, simply because there is a trade imbalance. UK imports the opium to China. China has difficulty with this. And but China appreciates America. America sent its aviation to China during Second World War to help us to beat the imperialist Japan. But unfortunately, the two countries fought in Korea, in Vietnam, and then the rise of Soviet expansionists brought China and US together because they have the idea of balance of power to handle the Soviet Union. But with the demise of the Soviet Union, then US think China is rising power. It's good for US to see China to join the international community, to integrate with the global system. But US is unhappy why China is doing something in Xinjiang and in imposing quote unquote national security law in Hong Kong. So US a problem. Why you do this? Why you don't honor your commitment under the WTO access paper? Why you build those artificial rocks in South China Sea? So President Obama tried to use multilateral means like a TPP, 12 countries to compete with China, but try to avoid unilateralism. US sued China in WTO, but the US is uninterested in beating China one-on-one. Then Trump used different way, quitting TPP, which does not benefit America, which actually does good to China, but then beat China, making China to build a paper by this January 15th, the first phase China-US trade and economic agreement. So China say, I'm going to buy more. But China is apparently unhappy. We try to open US access. Tesla can do its solely owned enterprise in Shanghai. And we try to make international financing, banking access to China to possess 51% of ownership. And we build international importation exhibition. Try to make more foreigner happy. They have more chance to sell their products in China. And we're unhappy with Trump's high-handed kind of undiplomatic one-on-one beating. But now, President-elect Biden says China is the U.S. Strategic competitor. He lowered the rivalry to view China as a rival. Trump thinks China is a rival. Probably Biden thinks the same, but he would use more diplomatic nuance to say you are a competitor. And it's not good to beat you. We should build our own competitiveness to finance the US innovation, not to blame why you finance your business. We should finance our own business, build the competition, not to beat you. But if you violate the paper, we still would sue you and beat you. So in this way, US seems to use a different definition. China is a competitor. I hope US would do this. Let's build a healthy, constructive competition, not unhealthy, a negative, beating China, compete and beating. Secretary of State Pompeo said, China, let's do distrust and verify. Previous US government said, trust and verify. I think it would be more inducive to be back to trust and verify. But if we verify you not to honor your word, we have to go to the system. But you honor, we'll continue to trust. So I think China and US may improve their relationship a bit at least. And potentially, China and US may restore their partnership on North Korean nuclear issue, Iranian nuclear issue, and climate change, and COVID-19, public security, health security partnership, to donate our money and vaccine to African country or anyone who needs them. US has made achievement. China may have also made some achievement. Could we partner like we used to partner for H1N1 or Ebola or AIDS? So this is a time to forget about those past unhappiness, to move forward, to excuse each other and build with our other friend in Saudi Arabia together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think from a regional perspective, the preference is that type of healthy competitiveness as opposed to full comity where the great powers cooperate against us, or complete animosity that also would be proven to be quite destructive. So
I should also point, as my good friend Alex is in Singapore, China US should also partner with Singapore. Let's build a better world, never to allow such a kind of global one-year lockdown in US, in China to re-emerge.
Yeah, there is a lot of room, I think, for cooperation, especially in critical issues, climate change, dealing with the pandemic. Thank you so much for the panel. I think now we have half an hour remaining for questions. I ask the audience to type their questions in the question box, but please do type questions that are relevant to the discussion and related particularly to the question of China and its security engagement with the Middle East, or its security presence in the Middle East. I think I would like to offer the floor first to His Royal Highness, Prince Turki Faisal. Let's see, he would like to comment and pose questions.
Am I being understood?
We can now hear you now, yes.
Okay. Thank you all, and my question is addressed to all of you. It is, how does China reconcile her commitment and strong defense of the principle of non-interference in the affairs of others, while at the same time engaging strategically with Iran, which is a practitioner of the interference in the affairs of others, whether it is in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and in other places, through their so-called either Hezbollah militias or the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, or the Houthis in Yemen. Did I finish?
Let me respond briefly. China has a principle non-intervention, but apparently at a time of global interconnectedness, everything are linked. And it's impossible for one country to do something that would not affect many other countries. They have a stake. So therefore, we should use one-on-one bilateral relationship. Sometimes we need to talk to the governing party, and meantime to talk to the opposition party. Then that may constitute intervention of internal affairs, because the government does not like the opposition, but sometimes opposition may become the next leader. So China talked to South Sudan, talked to Sudanese leadership, how Sudanese leadership should work with South Sudan under the African Union, under the United Nations. So if South Sudanese leadership cannot accept the UN peacekeeper, so China may send its peacekeeper. So China would not arrest the Sudanese president. But meantime, African Union may not militarily intervene in that country. And in this way, we try to help a peaceful transition, that a new Sudan with a legal Sudan and a new legal South Sudan would emerge. So China would train the new diplomats of South Sudan. And meantime, China would help people in Sudan when they need water, and our oil company would provide water. We made some interest, but we let the money be spent in the region. So you can say this is a new type of intervention, but the outcome looks more constructive. So this is how China is interpreting this is a constructive engagement. This is, in traditional way, it is some intervention, but for better outcome. And we send our police to join the UN platform to East Timor. And the UN approves. So what China do is to talk to the local government, talk to the local opposition, talk to the local organization like African Union and Arabic Union, and also to seek a permit from the United Nations. But never do if the host country would refuse. We would never do if Saddam would refuse. US does not get Saddam's permit, does not get the UN permit, and finding no evidence, send the military to Iraq for so many years. That hurts both Iraq and the US. This kind of intervention has no legitimacy. So we would never do it. We want to get the consensus of host government and consult with the host country's opposition and seek the regional leaguers kind of understanding. And if you need me, I come. If you don't need me, why I come? I still think China's participation in such a business is very limited. Most Chinese think Middle East, we never know. We should never be involved. And the more you engage with Middle East, the more we know we don't know Middle East. So why we should participate? For oil, for peace, and for a structure where these people are peaceful, they would not blame us. So in my view, don't take a biased view to support one side against the other side. For this, you win for short term, but you lose in long run. We should get all stakeholders think it's neutral, it's peace building. So I think over time, China may be more experienced in doing this.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. I don't know if Your Highness has any follow-ups or comments or input.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't think the doctor answered my question. It was particularly about Iran's interference in the affairs of other countries, and that is in contradiction to China's firm commitment to non-interference in the affairs of other countries. And yet Iran is a practitioner of that. And yet we see China developing a strategic relationship with Iran. So I'm just wanting to understand how the Chinese leadership reconciles what seems to be, for a layman like myself, as a contradiction on principles.
I might try to, sorry, if Professor Shen wants to reply.
It's on the record that we are against nuclear weapon development. We hope Iran would not do. And IAEA seems to have some suspicion. And China joins the IAEA to sanction Iran, joins the United Nations Security Council to sanction Iran. But we are not in a position to send the military into Iran to stop them. If we can block peace, they are willing to accept certain inspection, even in a limited level. Then we have more chance of security. But they cannot give us security without us to give their security. So they need money, they need medicine, they need energy. So China need to buy their energy, to refine their oil, to sell our energy to them. And their people need medicine. So how to make them to respect our legitimate need of security? Meantime, we give them their legitimate need of security. China is doing this. As to how they intervene, others' internal affairs, I hope my country would take a more embodied approach to stop them. But basically, we are not in a position to stop any other country. We would not send military to Iraq to defend Iran because US has wrongdoing. US is not only intervening into Iraqi internal affairs, it sends the military. Every country, including your own country, should send the military to expel Americans from Iraq. Why your country does not do it? Because we are not authorized by the UN. That's the way I tell you. It would be nice we stop other countries intervening, but at the moment, at the most we would do, we don't intervene. We are not in a position to stop other countries intervening. I'm so sorry to tell you this.
Well, perhaps I think one way in which oftentimes intervention is conceptualized in the region, at least in terms of Chinese support for Iran and its intervention policies, this is actually to bring in also a question from Mr. Ghulam Ali, who sort of pointed to what has been circulating in the media over the last year, which is the announcement of Chinese investment worth $400 billion over the course of 25 years. And that this is also connected to sort of a security and military umbrella provided by China for Iran. And this is oftentimes therefore seen as an empowerment of Iran itself. And, I mean, I'd like to hear, of course, the other panelists, but from my own sort of research, it seems that a lot of this is considerable exaggeration and in fact is not really based on any official or authoritative sources. So there tends to therefore be an imagining of sort of a Chinese building of a strategic relationship with Iran that isn't the case. If in any way, in most instances, economically, security-wise, China has a more substantive relationship with its Gulf partners on the Arabian side. Perhaps Arduino and Dr. Arduino or
yes,
Dr. Giazelli want to jump
please,
in.
let me apologize. I just realized my webcam doesn't like me. Having said that, we have to look a little bit back about the 400 billion. First and foremost, in the alleged leaked MOU, there is not a precise figure. It's been a little bit overestimated. Having said that, the MOU has been drawn with a broader view in a time when the JCPOA was already showing promise sign and not what we are having today. So in what we basically addressed before during the start of this webinar is the fact that different countries have a different perception and expectation of China. And in this case, the MOU has been leaked in Farsi. It has been basically used mostly for an internal use in Iran. Well, in one side, it could be used to show that Iran is not alone and the Chinese economic lifeline is going to have a long future with the country, or even for the Iranian government opposition that look at the current government selling off to China. And this is one of the fact that, as Mohammed just already mentioned, the MOU has been driven into the media, but the context has been overblown. And I don't see that any kind of military cooperation, that is a very vague term, is going to create a kind of Iranian-Chinese axis that is going to promote instability in the region. And it's something that definitely China is not looking at. If there is going to be a creation of kind of Persian Gulf Security Cooperation Organization, something in line with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it can be seen. Also, it can be seen if Iran sooner or later will be a member of the SCO. And that's my thought.
Do you have any comments? Or?
May I just on Iran? Can I?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Oh, sorry. The thing is, the principle of non-intervention is a principle. This is the key issue. In a region where I think is not only Iran who uses proxies in the pursuit of its foreign policy interest, I believe Chinese leadership simply has to accept it. That said, being a principle, the easiest thing to follow it is just to engage with governmental actors as much as possible in the region. So I think the question is how to reconcile the commitment to the principle with Iranian foreign policy. I think it just because this is, I guess, the reality of diplomacy in a way. And in the specific case of Iran, I would say that China has many vested interest in a way to continue to engage in a more or less strategic way with Iran. China was, we can look at it through the lens of Sino-US relations, of course, where the nuclear deal played a key role during the Obama administration, and China played a very important role in facilitating that. We can look at it from a more historical perspective, where China, since I believe the early 70s, announced what it can be called the literal principle, that is Iran as a key player in the Gulf, and in a Gulf that is not managed by external powers. Finally, I would say that part of its success, if you want to say, of a zero enemy policy is also that of engaging everyone. Even if China were to not engage with Iran, it would have, there might be a threat to its own interest. It might be seen as it would be seen by probably Iran, as the Prince mentioned, its proxies, as a threat, or at least a support as to Iranian rivals. So I think it's about reconciling different interests, and I'm talking about diplomatic interest as well as let's say domestic, I would say vested interest in Chinese own diplomatic tradition, no more, no less. So I would limit here, but I would not probably building on the question on the 25-year strategic agreement, and eventually I see there is another question on the SCO and Iran potential full membership in it. I will not tend to overread the fact that China might sign this agreement with Iran as putting Iran over other countries in the region. China, according to Iranian sources, at least some of the Iranian sources, for example, it's China blocking the upgrade of Iran's membership in the SCO. Yeah, I would totally agree with Dr. Arduino and Professor Shen in saying we should be very careful in not overemphasizing China's engagement with Iran, but we should look at it in the broader context of China's relations with the different regional powers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giazelli. I don't know if His Highness would like to add anything or thoughts to the panel's input. Because I see the hand is still up.
Well, I'll take it down.
Okay. Sure. Okay, well, we have actually a couple of questions that have come up. I'll take them from the bottom up. There's a question from Asif Shuja, which is a very sort of receptive question. They say, we are discussing here the changing security architecture in the Middle East. If this architecture is indeed changing, then changing from what? In other words, what is the current security architecture of the Middle East, if any? And if yes, who is the chief architect? This is one question. Perhaps we could field several and then give the opportunity for the panel to pose questions. Another question is from Ali Imam Yousefi, which is a follow-up to Prince Turki's question, is for how long can China afford to stick to its principle of non-intervention when regional issues like the Palestinian cause and Saudi-Iranian conflict directly and perhaps may fundamentally affect China's economic interests, especially in the Strait of Hormuz, near the in proximity to the economic zone of Duqm. And secondly, sort of as an associated question, if perhaps in future China is going to intervene, what does she have to offer to solve, particularly the above mentioned issues? So perhaps we can address these and then take the rest, if time permits.
Yes, I can jump in on the question of my colleague and friend, Dr. Asif Shuja. So I will start with an apology. Probably I was not enough clear when I mentioned at the beginning that we are changing and looking at this change in the security architecture, moving from a bipolar world in a multipolar world with a daily increase in uncertainty. Uncertainty also increase agency. So as Dr. Sudari mentioned, several other players are looking, regional players at the Middle East to fill security vacuum that has been in some respect left by the United States, but the United States is not leaving the region. It's probably going to be an offshore security balancer. So we are going to witness it probably a direction toward more interest in the Pacific, more interest in Asia from the Middle East, but then a more multi-layered engagement. And this is going to change and to change rapidly in the near future. And the threshold for kinetic confrontation, unfortunately, is going to be more limited. We are going to see that we are near, I think it's in February, when the STAR missile treaty for the medium range is going to expire. And I have a sincere doubt that it is going to be renewed. And this is only going to increase opportunity for confrontation. And in this respect, we all see that the intrinsic nature of warfare, it's always there, it's not changing, but the way the challenge are changing very fast with new domain. And as I mentioned before, the cyber domain, it's quite important. And I give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Giazelli, or to Professor Shen.
Well, I think it's hard to tell the structure, security structure is changing. The US is still there, sometimes plays a more important role in bridging peace between Israel and many Middle East countries. So not all people feel happy because such kind of peace building has not created probably more peace for the statehood building of Palestinian. But apparently, President Trump is making Israel feel more secure. So it's hard to say US is abandoning or it's leaving. But in the meantime, US is leaving Syria. US seems to be less interested in intervening into Libya situation. So President Trump's position seems to sometimes to be isolationist or neutralist, but sometimes still engaging. And U.S. is leaving no space for China to fill a potential void. For China's own interest, if the region is stable, its economy is more predictable, China is more able to predict its future economy. For China's own interest, we need peace there. For our own bigger powers' moral responsibility, we want the region to be stable and peaceful, with or without China's own tangible and physical interest. For this, we launched the Foundation for Middle East Peace and Development. And we appointed a special envoy for our own president. But I think the functioning and its impact of such kind of a tool and platform is still rather limited. Even though we invited Abbas and Netanyahu to Beijing, but they missed by one day. They don't meet. So even such a tacit and interesting kind of engagement does not create a situation like Camp David, a U.S. bridging peace. U.S. president sit with Palestinian and Israel leader, finally to get a deal, to get a Nobel Peace Prize together. I think China has not reached that level. And the region may not be ready for China to play such a role. But China is becoming more proactive and to give its due positive contribution to the region. So I cannot ascertain the structure of security has changed to this direction or to that direction. I think probably President Biden would still play a significant role in making the region kind of more secure and stable.
Do you have any thoughts on this issue, Dr. Giazelli, or should we take the next batch of questions?
I actually wanted to just give a brief answer to one of the, I think there was the follow-up question to Prince Al Faisal, I believe, on whether regional rivalry might threat China's own interest, for example, in the case of a war, and so far, in the extreme case of a war and so on. I think we should not, and how that might influence China's adherence to the principle of non-intervention. I think we can be quite sure that in case of growing tensions, let's say between Saudi Arabia, or Iran, or other countries, and so far and so on, China might try to mediate either bilaterally or eventually trying to bring policymakers together, although that would be more difficult. But I also believe that we should not overemphasize probably the risk for Chinese interest in case of a war between these countries, and especially if they are oil producing countries, as I'm quite sure that they, and probably also others, will be extremely careful to avoid hitting or damaging any Chinese asset or citizen in the region. And this because, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, China engagement, economic engagement with China is probably one of the key elements, especially in terms of flow of energy and so on, is one of the key elements that can sustain those economies at the moment. And therefore they will be very careful not to antagonize China or again, eliminate such an important lifeline. So I think China, of course, there will be pressure on China to intervene, but at the same time, I'm sure also those countries will be very careful not to force China to intervene in case of tensions or war. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more remaining questions and around 5 minutes left, really. One question is from Abdullah Dosri, which I think has been partially answered by the various different speakers, which is, do you think that the security relations between China and the Middle East will contribute to creating pressures towards, I guess, from Beijing, towards implementing the two-state solution and ending the Israeli occupation? I personally am very skeptical of such a possibility, whether in the near or mid-future. But I mean, maybe one of the panelists would be interested in giving us an unorthodox view. Another question comes from Professor Amidou Sani, and his question actually relates to the United States. If there is any new initiative to be witnessed in China policy with the new incoming Biden administration, and whether we should see any major differences between the Trump administration and its successor. I mean, this was partially raised by Dr. Shen somewhat, but I'd be interested in maybe hearing some of your views of what are some of the things that will be retained, what are some of the new things that might be brought in. And a last question from an anonymous attendee, but this is, I mean, if time permits, can be answered, is the attendee was wondering how China reacted to the presence of Uyghur elements in Syria in terms of its impact on its foreign policy, not to say its domestic policy.
I jump in first, as I already had the microphone on. So first question on the two-state solution and ending Israeli occupation. I perfectly agree with Dr. Al-Sudairi. I don't think that will be one of the possible results of China's deeper engagement with in the Middle East. And I would say it is not because, at least from what I can read from Chinese media and Chinese analysis, there is no interest in solving that problem. But rather because Israel is such a key country in the region, especially, of course, because of its relation with the United States, and also as an important source of technology in various fields for China, important economic partner, that I don't think China will put significant pressure on Israel to change its policy in a significant way toward the Palestinians. As to a possible Chinese initiative, as President-elect Biden will move to the White House, honestly, I believe that if Biden will stay true to his words, to his commitments to rejoin the nuclear deal, we might see actually a Chinese initiative, but more oriented toward actually bringing back the nuclear deal to life. So not an alternative, but I believe China will do what it can to facilitate the resuscitation of the deal. But not trying to push the United States out the Middle East or anything like that. Actually, more trying to recreate the situation before Trump. Finally, as to the Uyghurs in Syria, very difficult to tell. Chinese media do not really talk about it. Also, Syrian media rarely talk about it. Although the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad mentioned some sort of intelligence sharing with China, there are different reports. Also, I believe a document from the United Nations that confirms there are Uyghur element in Syria, or at least there used to be. But if and how that will push China to do more, or in a specific case to be more involved into the Syrian conflict, I don't think so. I think if it needs to, it has its own channels to cooperate with the Syrian government, or basically with any other government in the region. So I don't think there will be any significant change in that direction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, maybe if I could add a few words on the Uyghur question. If the person who posed the question was thinking about it in terms of more active counterterrorism work and the use of this type of discourse in Chinese foreign policy, it's important to emphasize that this has been actually a feature of Chinese foreign policy, at least from the 1990s, in the sense that if you look at the origin of the Shanghai Organization, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, one of its key features is one of combating what now is used in official discourse, the three evils, right? Which is, secessionism, terrorism, and extremism. And so this rhetoric eventually became updated in the early 2000s under the rubric of the American global war on terror, right, for various different reasons. So the point being is, while there would be a need for greater research and study about how has this presence filtered back and affected or changed Chinese foreign policy, the discourse on terrorism and counterterrorism has always been there, at least for more than 2 decades. And this is something that has been often emphasized by Chinese officials. I think, would Dr. Shen or Dr. Arduino have any last comments or words as we're approaching the end of the time?
Yes, I will be very brief. Thank you for giving me the floor. Basically, in what you mentioned, it's correct. The SCO, the fight against the three evils, separatism, extremism, and terrorism, it's still an important component, especially in the creation of the regional anti-terrorism structure in Tashkent. Having said that, moving to the question on the expectation between the relationship in the United States and China, then there's been a lot of talk, and one of the main trends was that even when President-elected Biden is going to be in the White House, there will be a change of tone, but not a change of content in the relationship between China and the United States. In this respect, I'm more optimistic. I'm going to see, let's say, more smart engagement. And related to the question, what kind of cooperation can be done, as Dr. Giazelli underlined, a kind of return to JCPOA can be a start, but also United States and China are definitely going to work on Paris Agreement, climate change, and the return of the United States probably to the WHO.
For 2 states, China has already established official relationship with Israel and Palestine. But we cannot and we are unable to impose peace upon any of them. We have good bilateral relationship, and it would be desirable for Palestine and Israel to agree. A 2-state approach is better for them. But China, I don't think, has the capacity to impose. We can only use our envoy, try to deliver the message to persuade them. But so far we have failed, which means China's discourse does not satisfy both Palestine and Israel. Still, we cannot develop our discourse, which is good for both. I think this would remain for quite some time. For 3 evil, we say we're against all kinds formats of terrorism. That's good, legally. But at the same time, we have to address the root cause of those radicalism. As some great people say, why they go radical? It's because they are in despair. They find no alternative to be better, so they are willing to give up their own life to take others' life. It's really terrible. But how to develop a discourse that you don't need to give up your life in order to take others' life? I think globally, United Nations still has not developed the case. And China tried to help, but in foreseeable future, I think we may not able to develop a certain discourse that would successfully dissuade all terrorists to understand that we should abandon terrorism. So we would beat terrorism, but probably we will be unable to persuade the terrorists not to proceed with future terrorism. I really feel grateful for this.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. I mean, I think also—
so sorry, I really feel regretful for this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shen. I mean, I think generally speaking, the categorization and thinking about what falls under the rubric of extremism and terrorism is going to be a contentious issue. And obviously the different approaches that states are formulating to address this have both some positive aspects, but also very problematic ones that need to be re-examined. I would like to, however, thank everyone, all of the panelists, for joining us for this wonderful event. I'd like to also thank our partners at the Middle East Institute for holding hands with us and organizing this. And I would also like to thank all the attendees for dedicating their time to come and listen to our thoughts on these various complicated issues. Just very briefly, these are some of the publications from the Asia Studies Unit over the past year. Please do visit our website, kfcrs.com, as well as the website of our own colleagues at the Middle East Institute. And please keep an eye on some of our future events in 2021. And hopefully we will see again Dr. Giazelli, Dr. Shen, Dr. Arduino in future events and benefit from their insights and wisdom.
Maybe in person.
Or in person, God willing, once the pandemic passes. Again, thank you all, and have a wonderful evening or afternoon wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.